Hello, Houston. We're just sitting here reminiscing about last week's, last lecture's assignment on the eyelid, the eye blink conditioning. So get on microphone for a minute and tell me what actually happened. We had one in class who actually tried it. Now, of course, the more general point to make here is, how do you know I'm not lying to you? I mean, I give this assignment on a tape, and none of you, save one or two, actually tried it out. I may be lying. Psychology may be a total science fiction. And if you don't ever go check it out, we're just going to pour knowledge in your head. You're going to accept it all coldly, assuming that because I'm a state-paid authority figure, that it's right. And then what if it isn't? How are you going to know if you don't try these things out? So your assignment is to do that before the next program. Now, what did actually happen when you went?
When I breathed in, he just turned to me and kissed me. No blinking, anything. He just turned and kissed.
Okay. And every time you go, does he now turn and kiss you?
No, actually, like the third time I did it, he blinked, and then he blinked the second time. So as I did it more, he blinked like throughout the night. Okay. But the first reaction was turn and kiss. He thought I was being sweet.
Oh, boy, we sure fixed that impression, didn't we? I was about tempted to bring him in here and see which response he would elicit, but we'll, okay, I'll take your word that it did work then. Okay, the rest of you, try it. All right, we were in classical conditioning last time, and we had reached the point where we were ready to start looking at the various ways in which we can measure classical conditioning. There turn out to be a lot of them, so I'm going to go through them fairly rapidly, but they're all in your simple psych book, so there shouldn't be a problem with it. One way to measure classical conditioning is to measure the magnitude of the response. That is, with the boyfriend in that instance, what we could do is measure how large the blink is, how much blink actually occurs. That is certainly what Pavlov measured with the dogs, was simply the amount of salivation that occurred in response to the various cues. The second possibility is to measure the probability of a response. That is, on a percentage basis, how likely is it that the organism will respond? Statistically, when you go to the person you're conditioning, what are the odds that they will in fact blink? And as you might expect on that one, also the likelihood goes up if conditioning is occurring. You get this kind of a response curve as you see on the screen here now. The third possibility is to measure the latency of a response. And the latency basically is going to drop. By that, what I mean is the distance or the time difference between when the conditioned stimulus is presented and when the person actually reacts in whatever way is appropriate given the conditioning. We would expect that time interval to shorten as the response moves earlier in that time sequence we were reviewing we were presenting in the last lecture. And finally then, the last one is one we haven't even talked about yet, so I'll talk about it and then actually define it for you. But essentially a fourth way to measure learning is to measure what is called resistance to extinction. And what we mean by that basically is that if, for instance, in conditioning the eyelid, every time you go right into your boyfriend's or girlfriend's face, and then all of a sudden from some point onward, which you determine, you now go and then never actually deliver the conditioned stimulus, the unconditioned stimulus, the net result is pretty soon they're going to stop blinking, at least within some period of time. And in essence, that's what we plot here in terms of, for instance, amount of saliva or amount of eye blink magnitude, or essentially anything. What happens is the magnitude drops, the amount drops, everything drops off until eventually when you go, they just kind of lean over and kiss you or something. But they do not in fact react at all to the conditioned stimulus that was working before. Okay, so that is, the point of that is that the more solid the training was originally, the better learned the response was, the longer it will take in terms of time to actually extinguish the response. I'll come back and show you a little bit later why that's actually the case. Now, having talked about extinction, let's actually define it for you. That means essentially the loss of a response. When a response is lost, we talk about it as being extinguished. This is what it looks like when we're plotting classical conditioning. That is, if we've been plotting the number of responses, for instance, during acquisition, that number goes up, the probability goes up, the magnitude of it goes up. And then when we go into extinction, that is when we start presenting only the conditioned stimulus alone, what happens is the number of responses drops off. The magnitude drops off, everything disappears, and eventually there is simply no response at all when you offer the conditioned stimulus, basically as there was no response at the beginning of conditioning when you started. Now, since we've brought you this far, there's a very interesting process that occurs, interesting at least to psychologists, and that is a process called spontaneous recovery. let's take the ideal situation. Suppose you had in fact conditioned your boyfriend or girlfriend, and on some kind of a sporadic schedule, you always went into their eye each and every time when you're sitting there curled up with them and enjoying yourself, okay? Now all of a sudden you go into extinction. After getting them well trained, you go into extinction, and from that point onward you decide, I'm never again going to actually puff air in their eye, and therefore you go, but you never again respond. That is, you never again deliver the unconditioned stimulus. What eventually happens, as we've already said, is that the behavior drops off. It disappears. Interestingly, if we take you out of the apparatus, supposing we've got you an eyelid conditioning apparatus or something that's blowing food powder in your mouth in response to a cue, we remove you from that apparatus after we've extinguished the response, and then 24 hours later we put you back in. What happens is what's diagrammed on the screen. That is, what you will get is a spontaneous recovery. Some proportion of the response that was there previously will return. No practice, no intervening reinforcement, and in fact none when we're testing spontaneous recovery at all. It's never reinforced again. And what happens is, if spontaneous recovery occurs, depending on how far after the original extinction it is and how many times you've tapped or assessed spontaneous recovery, you may get a 50% return the first time, 25% the second time, a 15% recovery, 10%, 5%, and then it may be 6 or 7 retests before the response is in fact truly extinguished. The question is, what causes spontaneous recovery? And the answer, watch it people, I'm going to actually move. What actually happens is that you get that spontaneous recovery effect for 2 reasons. And this took a lot of research to pin this down. What's actually occurring when you extinguish a response is 2 things. First of all, the organism is learning not to respond. Okay? And so part of the reason that the eye blink magnitude drops, part of the reason you're less likely to get a response, is that the organism has come to the realization, as you would, that, hey, he's not blowing in my face anymore. I don't need to blink. And at some level, they will stop responding, or they will certainly slow down, or the magnitude will decrease, the speed will drop, and so forth. They are extinguished. But another thing that's also going on, as you know, if you sat there by the television conditioning your boyfriend or girlfriend, or whatever you were doing, is that when you go into extinction, you get bored with it, they get bored with it, they get fatigued, and so forth. Boredom and fatigue disappear if you remove for 24 hours and then put them back into the same condition. Boredom and fatigue disappear. And so the net result is that the one way to envision extinction is that the proportion of spontaneous recovery that you get when it occurs after the extinction is attributable to that proportion of extinction that was due to simply boredom and fatigue. Because after you rest, that'll go away and there'll be a rebound effect, that spontaneous recovery. You can then extinguish it again. It'll extinguish a little more rapidly, a little faster. And next time when there is spontaneous recovery, if there is, it won't be as high. There won't be as much. So each time, proportionally, you'll get smaller and smaller amounts of spontaneous recovery. But in essence, the explanation for it is simply that the organism any organism, when being conditioned, eventually gets fatigued and tired, particularly if you put them into an extinction situation. Hence, spontaneous recovery. Now, the next thing we're going to look at then is 2 processes that are also vital here in order to make sure that conditioning actually works. One of these is what we call generalization. Generalization is essentially that, well, for instance, if you're sitting in a classroom now watching this, or for that matter, if you're at home, when you bought that house, when you rented the room that you're watching it in, if you're in a dorm or something like that, or in the classroom that we're in here as we're taping this, we did not have to have a door opening review activity mandated by the state fire marshal. Because in essence, you and I have learned how to open a variety of different doors. Most of them here at the university, if it's a big lecture hall, involve a bar that you push. But otherwise, it's something you twist or a button you push down on. There's something that opens the door. And we have developed a generalized response to that. So when we see a door, we don't immediately panic. We know what to do. And that's because of generalization. In essence, the way generalization can be tapped, and in fact I'm going to use the next example first to illustrate this. If we had trained the dogs originally with a tone at 1,000 cycles per second, the question is, if we sounded the tone at say 500 or 1,500 or some other tone other than the one that they were trained at, would the dog in fact salivate? And the answer is yes. And in fact, as the tone changes, as you can see in the diagram here in the graphed results, you end up demonstrating what is called a generalization gradient. That is, the greater the difference between the original training stimulus and the test stimulus, the lower the likelihood that you get a response. One of the tragic and very controversial examples of this was some work done by John Watson way back at the beginning, back in the teens and 20s, early on in our growing understanding of classical conditioning, in which what he did was to have a youngster age 12 or 13 months play on a rug in a very comfortable area in the lab at Johns Hopkins University. And what he did was to introduce a rabbit to the youngster, and the youngster, age 12, 13 months, was thrilled, had a great time playing with a rabbit, just having a ball in the enclosed area, that is the contained area where they were. What Watson did was to sneak up behind the youngster and clang two steel bars together. Bang! A very loud noise. And the result was, of course, as you'd expect, the youngster screamed. The research assistant came in, calmed the youngster down, got it back to laughing and happy again, reintroduced the rabbit, all's well. Here comes Watson, clang. About 3 or 4 times like this, and pretty soon the research assistant, each time by duty, comes in, calms the youngster down, everything's fine. This time when she introduces the rabbit, the youngster screams. And in essence, the explanation is the diagram that you see on the screen there. And that is that the unconditioned stimulus of loud noise elicits fear and crying and withdrawal and so forth and so on. And what's happened is that it has actually been conditioned to the rabbit. What Watson was studying was whether it was possible to classically condition fear, and the answer was a resounding yes. The reason I cover this under generalization is because what they then did was to introduce a white fluffy dog. Albert, who was the youngster who was being trained, screamed. Research assistant came in a white fluffy fur coat. Albert screamed. Tragedy of tragedies, Santa Claus came in, big white furry beard. Albert screamed. There's quite a debate in the literature as to whether Albert was ever deconditioned. And the best guess, the best evidence suggests that he never was, partly because apparently, and this may be just an apocryphal story, the mother found out about the research and withdrew her son from the research before Watson, who it is reputed intended to decondition the youngster, was ever able to do so. But in essence, what's demonstrated there is simply a generalized fear response. What the youngster ultimately associated it with was white fur, and it didn't matter what that white fur was attached to. He was terrified. And that was an example of generalized fear. So one of the processes that we're interested in then is generalization. But there's a second one that we really also have to have operating if classical conditioning is going to work effectively, and that is discrimination. That is, we have to know when to respond and when not to respond in a given situation. So a small one who looks at every male and says, "Daddy," is going to embarrass some or the mother, or both. And in fact, ultimately has to be taught to discriminate when to label somebody daddy and when not to. So that unfortunately, if they mediate on maleness rather than fatherness, they may end up emitting the wrong response in certain situations. That's an example where discrimination is necessary and where we have to learn how to respond in a particular way under one circumstance and with very subtle changes in a different way. That's the basis of what is called discrimination. Let me also then give you a couple of examples of some applications of classical conditioning. Let me see if I can find it in my notes here that I wanted to share with you. One of them that was kind of interesting, and there's a sad story by this, was that a researcher or an industrialist actually introduced a product in Chicago, it is reputed, called a tummy tutor. The tummy tutor was simply an electrical contact device, a button if you want, that fit between the belt and the waistband, between the belt and the skin of any male that wanted to learn to keep his tummy muscles tightened and tucked in. And the result was if you relaxed your tummy muscles, the contact closed and a loud buzz, a buzzer went off that was in your hip pocket, a loud, obnoxious buzzer, which of course then would obligate to explain that you're getting a pot belly and you've relaxed your muscles, and that's what set the buzzer off. So in this case, the theory was that the obnoxiousness of that would cause somebody to keep their tummy muscles tense. I saw that originally in an introductory psych books. I wrote to the author and asked for it, and eventually the author wrote back and confessed that they had not been able to track down the original source. They could supply no reference, and unfortunately they took the example out of the book, which really hadn't been my intent. But that, I would argue, is an example of classical conditioning that's occurred in that case. I've got another one, my favorite. Dear Abby, I'd like to know if there is anything in insecticide that could excite a man. Arthur is 55, just the age that most men start to slow down, but he's still going strong. He gets especially aroused right after he sprays our property for bugs. I noticed it last year when we moved into this house. We had ants and roaches, and right after Arthur sprayed, he started looking for me. He would get so passionate that he didn't care if I did my housework or even cooked. Last year was bad enough, but this year it's worse. On weekends, he sprays sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. It's really getting me down. We live in Florida. What brand of bug bomb will kill the bugs down here without bringing out my husband's manhood so strongly? He uses Raid, TNT, and Rid-a-Bug, and they all have the same effect on him. The brands that don't affect him don't have any effect on the bugs either. Please help me. Tired. Abby responds, Dear Tired, my chemical experts know of nothing in any brand of insecticide that will rejuvenate the waning desire of man. If there were, we'd have a lot more dead bugs, livelier husbands, and tired wives. I would suggest that what probably happened there is classical conditioning of the following kind. The conditioned stimulus, I'm going to argue, is the bug spray. As you may know if you've ever moved, moving is an extraordinarily disruptive process. It's tiring because of all the packing and the carrying and so forth and so on. And if you read the story carefully or listened to it, they were in Florida. So I suspect they were tired from somewhere, moved to Florida, and therefore had to pack, move, unpack, and so forth. And when you move into a house in the South, as we know, you often have to reclaim it from the bugs that have moved in. And so what they probably did, as most of us would, is to try the canned spray first, set it off and leave the bug bomb and leave it for 2 hours, uninterrupted. Having done that, that 2 hours was probably the first uninterrupted time that Arthur and his wife had during the day when they weren't exhausted, and thus they ended up turning to lovemaking. And likely what also happened, my surmise would be, is that it didn't work. I mean, the bug spray. And the net result was they had to do it again 2 or 3 days later, and therefore they had a second opportunity because they had been deprived for a couple of weeks. And what happened was that Arthur essentially accidentally conditioned himself, now believing that the bug spray is actually critical to his performance as a man. So I would say that the conditioned stimulus there is the bug spray. And in fact, it has caused Arthur now to start needing to have the bug spray in order to perform successfully. I don't believe it, but I think that's what probably happened to him. Yes?
So how do you explain sprays that don't kill the bugs that will affect them?
Interesting. I thought about that, and my suspicion would be that they're probably weak enough that they don't include instructions where the products that she mentioned, if you read the instructions, because it's a very powerful spray, always ask the person to leave the room. That is, they warn specifically this is a poison. Do not be in the room for 2 hours and leave the circulation off so it just kind of settles in there. And I'll bet you the weaker sprays don't have that, and probably also the reason they're weaker is because they don't work. But that's my surmise as to what was going on in that situation. Didn't think I was going to get out of that one, did you? That's a good question. Okay, we're into operant conditioning now. The start of this actually traces back to the work of Edward Thorndike, who did some work in the early part of the 20th century related to what is now called trial and error learning. What he used to do was put cats, for instance, into what's called a puzzle box, and that puzzle box always had a way in which the cat could be released to get to food that was outside the box. So they had incentive, but they had to learn a puzzle. They might have to press on a pad or bat at something or chew on a string. There was always something that had to be done to release them from the box. And what he discovered was that over time, they learned to be quite effective at releasing themselves. That early work in the study of trial and error learning led eventually to the work that B.F. Skinner initiated, which has become the starting point of modern-day operant conditioning. It's also sometimes called instrumental conditioning or Skinnerian conditioning. They're all referring to exactly the same thing. The most widely used word is simply operant. But in any case, in the 1940s, 30s and 40s, Skinner initiated a series of studies at Indiana University and eventually moved to Harvard, where he spent the vast portion of his career, utilizing boxes that came to look like this. They were traditionally by Skinner called standard controlled environment chambers, but in fact, everybody else calls them Skinner boxes. He was not a self-aggrandizer and was embarrassed by the name, but in fact, this is a Skinner box. Now, the box itself is usually has a steel grid floor. The reason for that being that if we want to punish the animal, delivering shock through the feet is the most effective way to do it. But the more important benefit of that is that if the animal defecates, and animals do, it doesn't soil the floor of the cage. It simply falls through the bars to a sawdust catch basin below so that the cage itself stays clean while the animal is in it. And the bars are close enough so that the rats don't have any trouble standing on it. That is, it isn't uncomfortable for them. Now the key element is over here. It's a little small on the picture, but I'll put the pointer at it, and that is the bar. That bar is about the size of my index finger, or your index finger, likely. And it normally, in this being a chamber designed for rats, is about 2 inches up off the floor so that it's comfortable for a rat to lift his paw and right at comfortable height. That's where the bar would actually be. Let me point out a couple of other things. There is, if you can see it here, what is called a food cup. Over on this side, just to the left of the bar, is a food cup. Behind the machine is a pellet dispenser. This bar here is a micro switch, so-called micro switch. Even the slightest downward pressure closes the contacts and causes this pellet dispenser to advance. So the net result is, if the rat presses the bar, the pellet dispenser, which operates just like a penny gumball machine, twists slightly, a little pellet of food about the size of a BB or a piece of buckshot rolls down the tube that you can see back here, rolls down this tube into the food tray so that the animal can get it. So when the animal is operantly conditioned, is properly conditioned, it will press the bar and feed itself. So it presses the bar, eats the food, press the bar, eat the food, and so forth. Animals are not dumb. I saw an apparatus one time and a rat in it, where the researcher had wanted to have the rat press a bar, eat food, go press another bar and eat food, come back and press the bar and eat food, and so forth. Rats are not dumb. What this rat did, the mistake the researcher made was to put the food cup between the two bars, figuring, well, there's less walking. Rat outsmarted that one. One paw here, get your mouth down here and just go whap, 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 and eat mightily all the way through without any problem at all. But in any case, we need to get the rat to press the bar. In order to do that, we're going to engage in a procedure that involves, first of all, magazine training. The first thing that we want to do is to get the rat to associate that bar with food, okay? And what we're going to do is to smear food onto the bar and then engage in some classical conditioning, some old-fashioned classical conditioning. When the rat is put into the Skinner box, 23 hours food deprived, we smear food on the bar, and because it's a micro switch, the very act of eating the food off the bar and licking it causes the bar to close and exercise the food, the pellet dispenser. Whether or not the rat eats that dispensed food, the fact is that having eaten the food in the context of that sound going off leads eventually to classical conditioning, as you see here. And what we're hoping for, and the reason it's done this way, is that way the good feelings that are elicited by food become associated to, classically conditioned, to the sound of the food delivery mechanism. In essence, what we've done here is create, as we called it last time, a secondary reinforcer. So that now if we deliver if we override mechanically and operate the food dispenser, it creates a reinforcer for the subject based on this kind of conditioning. Now watch what I'm going to do here. Notice what happens to the labels, because now what I'm going to do is to use the sound as the reinforcer. Let me back up so you can see what I just did there. That's the original training where food is the unconditioned stimulus and the unconditioned response is the eating and good feelings that are elicited by it. Now, once we've got the sound conditioned, I'm now going to use that as the unconditioned stimulus. An unconditioned stimulus, unconditioned response does not have to be inherited. It can be learned, and here's an example of one. So now what we're going to do is to use the sound as a secondary reinforcer, as we defined it the other day, and what we're going to use it to do is to reinforce the behaviors that we want to get out of the organism, leading to the bar press. Okay? So that what we're going to do is to use reinforcing. We're going to reinforce the rat by simply sounding the apparatus. And again, remember, this is based on that link to the unconditioned stimulus food that we originally had. Okay? Now, once we're done with magazine training, we're actually going to participate in what's called shaping. And by shaping, what we mean is essentially the reinforcement of closer and closer approximations to a desired behavior, whatever that may be. Sometimes it's called shaping. More generally, the method that we're using is what's called the method of successive approximations. And the definition will be very similar here. But essentially, we're using behaviors of which the organism is already capable, and we're essentially sequencing them in such a way that it will do what we ultimately want it to do. The method of successive approximations is essentially what Gunter Gable Williams used to use with his tigers and the big cats for Ringling Brothers, Barnum and Bailey. He essentially would condition them using the operant conditioning principles that we're talking about right here. We now face the task of getting the rat to actually bar press, okay? So in this particular instance, what we're going to do using the method of successive approximations is, if the rat is over on this side of the box, if that rat even turns in the direction of the bar, we're going to override the food delivery mechanism and have that sound occur, which tells the rat, in so many words, you're doing the right thing. Now it's not enough to turn. Now we want him actually facing before we'll give him another reinforcer. And then he has to lift a paw to start to step, and pretty soon we want him walking toward the bar before we will actually do that reinforcer. Eventually, when he gets to the bar, it's enough to just be facing it, but eventually we're going to want him to lift a paw and then have it extended and then over the bar. And by that time, the rats have pretty well hit the bar, and they can be trained to do so. In that case, we're using a shaping procedure in what's called the method of successive approximations, and we reward responses that are closer and closer to the one that we actually want, which is the bar press. Sounds complex? There are films of Skinner conditioning a rat in less than 2 minutes. A rat that has never before been in a Skinner box, put in the box by Skinner, and then him using the override button. Within 2 minutes, he's got that rat pressing the bar without any problem at all. A number of years ago, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Rochester, in our experimental psychology class, we had a very interesting, simple demonstration that we were trying to do. Some of us were given a Skinner box and a rat and told simply, put the rat in the box and observe what happens. Now, what you will expect, and what happened to our rat, is that the rat will normally explore. A rat that's hungry is moving because it's looking for food. And so when it's in a Skinner box, even if it's hungry, it's exploring the environment. And they will normally eventually stumble across the fact, because they're up, they're down, they're everywhere. They'll eventually stumble across the fact that, gee, when I hit this, food arrives. Okay? The other half of the people in the lab were supposed to actually condition the rat, that is, use the override button and see if they could condition any faster. Our rat actually took about 45 minutes to finally get to the point. Talk about a boring lab, but it was very instructive. Witness, I still talk about it. Eventually, he was down near the bar when he conditioned himself. He was down near the bar and he was sniffing around feverishly, kind of right around on the floor. And as he came back around, having completely turned around, his elbow, if you want to call it that, hit the bar. The sound occurred and food was delivered. And he got really excited. He ate the food and then he is sniffing feverishly around by the, where is it? And as he came around a second time, he hit the bar. And pretty soon we had a rat that would turn around and press the bar. Okay? So that in essence, the rat had actually conditioned himself by accident. But if you think back to what we were talking about last time, what he's demonstrated essentially is the law of effect. That is, in that case, because he was hungry, food was a very positive experience for him. And so when turning and bar pressing produced food, he learned to turn and bar press. And that was what was reinforced. It was actually superstitious behavior, but in fact, that's exactly what happened in that case. In general, what we've just conditioned there is what we refer to as an operant. An operant is basically any response that modifies the environment in a predictable way. And the reason I call the bar press an operant is because we don't care whether the rat is left or right-handed. We don't care whether he uses his left or his right rear foot. Right or left rear foot. He could use his hip, he could use his tail, he could use his chin. We don't care. We just want to make sure that he presses the bar. So that would qualify as an operant. And that's what operant conditioning is about. That is modifying classes of behavior or groups, clusters of types of behavior. Now, in terms of footnotes, there are a couple of things I want to illustrate for you by way of what can be done with operant conditioning. One of those is the use of what's called, let me back up just a second, stimulus control of behavior. Okay? And I've just cued what I was going to do here, and that is, this is an example in Houston of stimulus control of behavior. If you see this, you grin and keep going, right? What if you see this in Houston? Yeah, you speed up, of course. And when you see this, within 2 or 3 or 4 cars, the traffic will stop, okay? We're a little sloppy on that end. I almost had an accident when I moved here from South Carolina because in Columbia, South Carolina, where I taught a quarter century ago, the tradition was that you jump the light. You jump the green, and because of that, in that town, people always stop when it goes to orange because they know the traffic's going to jump. Almost had an accident the first day I was here because I jumped the light, almost got broadsided. So I learned quickly. But in any case, that's an example of stimulus control of behavior. The theme music that we use on this course is another example of stimulus control of behavior. That is, as soon as that Psy logo comes up with the blue background, you know that we're launched and ready to go. And although you may be getting coffee while the lead-in is coming on, you're probably down ready with your pen by the time I actually start lecturing. If not, we need to talk. But in essence, that's stimulus control of behavior. That is, in essence, what is going on there. There's another thing we can also talk about, and that is superstition. That rat that I was describing earlier is a particular example of a superstitious response. Guy Lewis, our beloved and longtime basketball coach forever, had a polka dot towel with him anytime he was coaching the U of H Cougars at a basketball game. And I talked to some of his assistant coaches when he used to be here, and there were some tales to tell about what they had to do to find a polka dot towel sometimes if they had forgotten to pack it on an away game. They had a stock here. But in essence, that's an example, I'm sure, of superstitious behavior. That one day, I'm sure Coach Lewis won a game that he didn't expect to, and he had the towel's polka dot. It must have been the towel. Tom Landry of the Dallas Cowboys always wore that fedora. I'm sure it was superstitious behavior, again, that he won a big game and had that hat on, and the next time he wore it, he won, and basically it's a matter of accidental conditioning, but it is what we usually call superstition when this actually occurs. Now, measurement of operant conditioning is a little bit more complex, but fairly straightforward. We use what's called a cumulative recorder. And a cumulative recorder looks like the device that you see on the screen here now. You will notice that it is actually a roll of paper that is feeding out of that from the right to the left. And what I've done is simply superimpose an outline on top of that, and then I'm going to take that outline and move it over here and rotate it a little bit this way, and then put some labels on it for you so you can see what's happening. The paper is feeding from left to right on this machine. Okay? There are two markers which are barely visible on the machine itself, but one of them is what's called the response marker. What that pen does on this machine, as it's diagrammed here, is jump up just a little bit every time the rat presses the bar. And so the result is, because the paper is feeding constantly to the left as we're looking at it here, if the rat is not pressing at all, the line is absolutely flat. If the rat is there pumping away very rapidly, then in fact the pointer is going up very rapidly on the graph. So in essence, the slope of the line on that graph is a direct translation as to how fast the rat is bar pressing, at what rate it is actually pressing. So in essence, what you've got here is what's called a cumulative recorder. That is, it keeps track of all of the responses that the rat emits in this situation, and we can then take that graph and put on it also, most machines will have on it what's called an event marker. And what that marker does is to mark the reinforcements when they occur. The little jig marks that you see on the graph there represent when a reinforcer occurs. And you'll notice anytime there's an event marker on the bottom, there is also one up on the diagonal line itself, so that you can put it right on the response marker. Some will actually separate it. But either way, you've got a record of the reinforcement and the rate of responding that is going on in that situation. So response rate is what we're particularly interested in. And as I said, exactly as we were looking at that tape, we can look at the tape and infer whether the organism is responding slowly, if at all, at a moderate rate or at a very rapid rate. Keep that in mind as we then look at schedules of reinforcement. This group, that is the group of investigators that have studied operant conditioning, have really done some amazing work in looking at the very different ways in which you and I get reinforced for various activities. The simplest is to simply utilize what is called continuous reinforcement, often labeled simply CRF. Almost nothing you and I do is continuously reinforced, other than perhaps the love of a child. You're nice to a child is always nice to you. And that's a very nice, very important kind of human relationship. It's one of very few that actually involves continuous reinforcement. Because you know as well as I do, you ask for a date, you may get it, you may not. You make a move for a kiss, you may get it, you may not. I mean, all of life basically runs on what is called partial reinforcement. That is, we are not actually getting reinforced every time, which would be continuous reinforcement. We are instead operating with partial reinforcement, where some proportion, but not all of our efforts, are in fact rewarded. The only example I was able to think of in everyday life of something that is pretty close to continuous reinforcement is Robin Williams, who as a comic, well, as an individual, is close to genius. He is a very bright individual. And you combine that with his sense of humor, and almost every time he opens his mouth, it's funny and it's entertaining. And the result is that he is, as a human, probably as close to being on a continuous reinforcement schedule as anybody I could think of by way of example. But that's rare. More often, you and I are on a partial reinforcement. You crack a joke, it works, it doesn't work. The simplest of these schedules is what's referred to as a fixed ratio schedule. What we do in a fixed ratio schedule is to reward exactly every so many responses. Okay? As an example, with the fixed ratio schedule, a number of years ago I had a paper route when I was in high school, and I would deliver and collect from my customers once every 2 weeks. So I was on what, if that was the way I did it, if I collected every other Friday night, I would be on what we would call an FR14 schedule. Throw 14 papers, get paid. Throw 14 papers, get paid. An airline's frequent flyer mile program is an FR schedule. Fly a mile, get a point. Fly a mile, get a point. Assemble 1 million points, fly a mile free. It's not quite that bad, but you have to accumulate a lot of points. But that's a fixed ratio schedule. For every mile you fly, you get a point. Point for point, mile for mile. That's a fixed ratio schedule, and what it produces is a very steady response rate. Unions hate this, and in fact, when an industry is threatening to use it, unions will go out on the boards to get it stopped, because it puts a great deal of pressure on the workers to do it on a piece rate basis. And the result is, just like the rats in a Skinner box, when you and I are on a fixed rate basis, we will deliver a lot of work. Which is the reason industry loves it and labor unions don't like it. But in any case, that is what's called a fixed ratio response. My paper route actually didn't run that way. I was in high school, I was busy like we all are. Sometimes I collected Thursday, it might have been Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, and in fact, sometimes I might skip a week. So I was on a schedule that probably ranged between 7 and maybe 21 or 22 days, actually. And so in essence, what I was really on was not a fixed ratio schedule, but rather a variable ratio, or VR schedule. That one differs only in the fact that the relationship between one reinforcer and the next fluctuates. We're still doing it on a numerical basis. So in the long run, my paper route would have been actually more accurately described as reinforcing me on what would be called a VR 14 schedule. That is, it was a variable ratio 14. I didn't collect exactly every other Friday night, but about every 2 weeks I collected, okay, my money. And so in essence, I was on actually a variable ratio schedule. That produces a very different kind of response rate, and that is that because I should correct it, it is a moderately different response rate. It's slightly higher, usually, because of the fact that you've got the incentive of knowing there are rewards coming, but you don't know when they're going to occur. Okay? That is classically illustrated by one-armed bandits. Classic example of a variable ratio schedule. Okay? The example there is very simple, and that is that has to work on a variable ratio schedule. And the reason is that it can't be a fixed ratio, because if it is, as soon as the machine pays off, any good Samaritan will hang a coffee cup on the handle that says just paid, and nobody will put money in because they know you have to pay a certain amount before you get reinforced again. So it has to be a variable ratio schedule. All right? It also turns out to produce a very high, steady rate of responding. A number of years ago, the daughter of my cousin got married in Las Vegas. She had worked for the union many years there and had a very lavish, quite beautiful wedding while she was there. While I was there, I should say. One of the days that I was walking through the hotel to get to an activity, I walked through the room where the gambling machines are, and there were 4 machines lined up, and a woman, an older woman, had lined up chairs in such a way that it was just a classic example of territoriality. These are my machines. And what she did, 1 coin, pull the handle. Step to the right, 1 coin, pull the handle. Step to the right, 1 coin, pull the handle. 1 coin, pull the handle. Take a puff or have a drink. Coin, handle. Coin, handle. And it was 1, 2, 3, 4, smoke or drink. 1, 2, 3, 4, smoke or drink. 1, 2, without stop. And I stood there fascinated for about 10 minutes and watched her. One of the machines had a gob of coins there. Never picked them up. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, pull the handle. It is a very addictive behavior. And the idea that we have things like Gamblers Anonymous is exactly reflectant of that variable ratio schedule. Bottom line, you are going to lose money. And all that woman really did for the clubs was to set it up to increase the amount of money the club was going to get. Because in the long run, they are not in the business of giving money away. If they were, they'd be broke. Those machines are there to earn money, and they are devastatingly effective at doing so. Okay? But all she did by lining up those 4 and claiming them was to increase the take of the club. They only needed 0.5% of every dollar she was putting in. I mean, they were rich, and rightly so. Okay, enough said. I'll get off my platform here. And instead, what we'll look now at is a different kind of partial reinforcement schedule. Now let's do it based on time instead of ratio of responding. Now if we do a fixed interval schedule, what's going to happen here is that we're going to reinforce. After a reinforcer, there's going to be a time break. The clock runs, and as soon as the clock reaches the end, the next response will be reinforced. So there's a fixed interval. It's a little loosey-goosey because of the fact that if the organism doesn't respond immediately, the interval can be quite a bit longer. But the basic principle is, after a reinforcer, there's going to be an interval before you can get the next reinforcer. That produces a very different type of response schedule for us, and that's this one. And you will recognize this, particularly when I give you an example of it. What happens is, and this is what's called a scalloped schedule. The point is that in this, after a reinforcer occurs, the organism gradually learns when they're on what is called a fixed interval schedule, gee, I never get a reinforcer if I bar press after getting a reinforcer. So the heck with this, I'm just going to kick back. And what happens eventually is that you get the highest response rate on any schedule that you get on the fixed interval schedule just prior to when the interval lapses. Because we organisms are not dumb. Rats, pigeons, us, doesn't matter. We learn the fixed interval schedule, and we produce this scalloped curve. This is evidence of an organism that has been on that schedule for quite a time, because he doesn't waste responses immediately after the reinforcer. He waits. And then when the reinforcer is coming, he will start responding again. Okay? You think about it, university life runs on a fixed interval schedule. Go 4 weeks, have an exam. Go 4 weeks, have an exam. And if I were going to predict study behavior on your part, I would argue that you studied feverishly the day of and the day before the exam. I'll bet you didn't crack a book the day after the exam. For how many people in the room does that not describe your behavior? I rest my case. You are seasoned veterans of a fixed interval schedule. Okay? And your behavior is highly predictable as a consequence of it. Think back to what I said about SR psychology way long ago, and that is that they argue that free will doesn't exist. This would be the kind of data they would cite. The behavior of you and I is highly predictable if you know the reinforcement history. And if you're on a fixed interval schedule, this is the behavior we expect, and this is what you and I do. And I'm just as guilty as you are. Don't you hate instructors that give pop exams, pop quizzes? Because in essence, what they're doing is not a fixed interval, it's a variable interval schedule. Okay, in that case, we reinforce every so many responses, but the actual range, the interval between any given pair of responses, is random. It may be very long, it may be very short. And so the net result is that with a variable interval schedule, what you get in this case is a very different kind of schedule. It is the slowest but the steadiest response rate that we'll find. And you notice in this case, there are even fewer reinforcers that are necessary to maintain this schedule. Interestingly enough, the instructor who puts you on a pop quiz schedule is actually doing you a strong favor, because as we're going to see in human learning a little later, the most effective way to learn material is to study a little bit all the time, to distribute your practice. We've essentially achieved that with the text that we use in a slightly different way. That is, the text still runs on a fixed interval schedule, but we've put in a lot of intervals. And so in essence, what we get is this kind of an effect. But in fact, we do get you studying. And that's part of the reason that it's designed in the way it is. The literature is pretty strong in endorsing what we're doing with this, and the data suggests it too. Students do better here. Now, let's also look at extinction in operant conditioning, which does occur. And that is that as the curve flattens out here, the animal is telling us, I'm getting tired, I'm full, I'm not hungry, whatever. But in any case, if we stop feeding it at some point, then this is the kind of response curve we get. That is, the rate eventually drops to zero. The organism simply stops responding. And it turns out we also get spontaneous recovery. So that if in the organism now we give it a rest period and then put it back in the box, look at what happens to behavior. It doesn't kick up as far, and it doesn't have as many responses before it starts leveling off again. But in fact, we can show it. So this is what spontaneous recovery would look like when we're plotting data on a Skinner box. If the organism is fully extinguished, then what will happen is when they're put back in the box, they won't respond at all. Okay? Those are kind of the extremes that you would see in demonstrating spontaneous recovery. We also have generalization in operant conditioning. I'm not going to spend any time on this particular one, but discrimination is worth talking about a minute, because the Skinner box has been used to learn a great deal about animals in the following way. Let's suppose that we set up a Skinner box like the one that we've got here at the moment. We've got two greens, and I forgot to diagram them randomly oscillating, but in fact, normally in the example I'm about to give you, sometimes the green would be on the right, sometimes the dark green would be on the left. It will be randomized, and I forgot to put that in when I created this. But let's suppose that we're going to reward the rat every time the right-hand green light is on, and by that what I mean it's the dark green light. Anytime the pure green light is on, we will reward you. That is, you can press the bar and get food. But if the light green light comes on and you bar press, we're going to shock you. That is, your paw will feel a distinct shock. Rats will very quickly learn discrimination. Okay? They will very quickly learn to press when the dark green light is on and not when the light green light is on. Now we're going to use that discrimination to learn something about the rat. Now we're going to make it just slightly harder to make the choice. We're going to make the lighter green a little bit darker, and a little bit darker, and a little bit darker, and just about the point when it reaches equality, which it now is at, the rats will exhibit what is called experimental neurosis. That is, as the discrimination becomes harder, when it reaches the point where they cannot make the discrimination, rats will traditionally do one of two things. Either they stop responding. If they've had enough food, they simply won't go near it. I may get shocked, I may not, it's not worth it to me. Or they always respond. That is, they stop discriminating. They simply bar press regardless of which light is on. And in that case, what you've done is to reach the perceptual limits of the organism. So here's a case where the learning on literature, the literature on learning, our experience with learning, is now able to be applied in very interesting ways to learn stuff about organisms. And we've used the Skinner box here to reveal something about the perceptual capabilities of a rat. What reinforces a college lecturer for note-taking? I'm misspeaking that. I shouldn't have said so much. What reinforces a college lecturer? What do you control at your seats other than note-taking? Very good. Sharp. What can you do to reinforce a lecturer for doing something from your seat? There are several that you control if you think about it for a minute. Okay, paying attention. That's one. Somebody else, give me another one.
Ask a question.
Ask questions, by all means. That's another one. Somebody else, give me another one. Any way that you can indicate pleasure with an organism. How else can you do it? A couple of you are doing it here now.
You could smile and nod or make eye contact.
Yes, the "oh, you brilliant fellow" nod is very reinforcing to a college lecturer, as is a smile. And there's another one related to smiling that's also very important. It's a huge social reinforcer.
Paying you money.
Paying money. All right, enough lecturing.
Well, I mean,
No, eye contact. Eye contact is a universal social reinforcer. How bizarre it would be if I'd spent the entire semester lecturing to the lights. Nobody in television land, nobody in the class would pay attention to me. Eye contact is very powerful as a social reinforcer. Okay? We have a television monitor over here next to me which blocks my view of some of the students over on the other side, and I know for a fact that they don't look at me as much because I don't look at them as much. I can't see them because it's blocked by the TV. But that's a reinforcer. We had a college lecturer who had a room that was 4 seats deep, 22 seats wide. Only a college could design that room and put the board on the long wall. This dude used to lecture with an eraser in one hand and chalk in the other, and when he walked, he turned and wrote on the board whenever he had the great thought. And the problem was, if he was at one end of the board and wrote something, he always then erased it when he was done, which was sheer hell for the person sitting on the other side over here because you couldn't see the board because of the angle. So we decided we were going to reinforce him for lecturing here. When he was here, rapt attention. Everybody taking notes, they're watching, a couple of hands are in the air, there's smiles. Perfect classroom. The closer to either end that he went, the closer toward chaos the room descended. 10 minutes, and we had him so effectively conditioned that he lectured for the rest of the year from right here at the podium. You think about dating. All of that is controlled by operant conditioning. You make an advance, you're either rewarded or punished. If you're rewarded, you make a further advance. And all of dating is basically an exercise in applied operant conditioning. We'll pick it up with the next lecture.